Hello, everyone. I'm Kamini Sani, the director of the Museum of Art and Photography, or MAP, in Bangalore. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the fourth session of the Deep Dive. In this series, we present researchers, curators, designers, and historians from around the world, exploring ideas, objects, or in-depth concepts, as the title suggests, and taking us on journeys across time and geographies. In today's session, we do a deep dive into the life and works of sculptor and printmaker Kim Lim, whose practice is receiving renewed attention in both the UK and Asia. Lim is a Singapore-born British artist. And the person who is going to take us on that journey today is our guest speaker, Adele Tan. Adele is a senior curator at the National Gallery of Singapore and former assistant editor at the British Art Journal. She was part of the curatorial panel for the 4th Singapore International Photography Festival, as well as the inaugural Bangkok Art Biennale in 2018. She is currently working on upcoming exhibitions for the artists Kim Lim and Theo Enseng. You will find a more detailed bio of Adele in the chat box below. I first met Adele many years ago when we were both participants in the Tate Intensive program at the Tate Modern in London. And I'm delighted to be able to host her on the MAP platform today. Some housekeeping details before Adele begins. Just use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen to address your questions to her. And we will have time for this interaction in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. Following this conversation, we will be screening a short video from our series Museums Without Borders. The selected episode today is a collaboration between MAP and the Vitra Design Museum. Jochen Eisenbrand and Divya Thakur discussed two iconic chair types, a Rietveld red-blue chair from Vitra's collection and a PETA chair for MAP. Do stay back for a few minutes to watch this after the talk. Adele, thank you very much for making the time for this presentation and for being a part of the deep dive. I would also like to thank Diksha from Signable for doing the Indian Sign Language interpretation for this session today. Adele, it's over to you.
Thank you, Kamini, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. It's a Friday evening over in both Bangalore and Singapore. So thanks for spending your precious evening hours with me. Let me start by sharing my screen. Do you all see this? Yes?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So just let me, hang on a minute. So a couple of things before I go into this presentation, which is that this talk series being called the Deep Dive, I'm not really going to be doing a kind of a direct deep dive, but I see this as a kind of a work in progress because I'm also preparing for the exhibition in tandem. And so I see this as a kind of series of multiple dives where I am going under the water and then rising to the surface again for new breaths and then diving again to find new things to look at and connections to make. And also I find this talk of mine today quite apropos because the previous deep dive talk was presented by my colleague at the Tate Modern, Dr. Suk-Young Lee, who talked about the transnational as a curatorial method. And so I found this quite apropos that I will be talking about Kim Lim today, who obviously would be a kind of a key person or key artist to look at when talking about the transnational. And a little bit more about the title that I use today, which is quite a prosaic one, which is that of the life and works of Kim Lim. So it already signals to you that it's going to be quite a biographical take, more or less quite conventional one, but I'm also using this as a kind of a scaffold to talk about other things and to bring in other types of critical reflections and questions to looking at the practice of Kim Lim. And I'd like to begin by just also reflecting on her name. It's important to also think about what we kind of call ourselves, right? And Kim Lim, she was born in 1936 in Singapore and then traveled to the UK for further studies and went to art school there. And she eventually passed away in 1997 in London and the United Kingdom. And so for all intents and purposes, most of our critical literature would reference her as Kim Lim. But as I started digging more deeply into her life back here in Singapore, I also realized that she had other names that she went by that kind of also gave me a kind of a lever to open up different facets and different prisms, right, into her world. And so she was born as Lim Cheng Kim. So Lim is the last name, and her Chinese name is Lin Jing, Lin Zhenjing, which means literally real gold. And she also had an English name, Shirley. And Shirley Cheng Kim Turnbull is her married name because she married the Scottish sculptor William Turnbull in 1960. And so already what she is called and how she was called gives us a clue into the different facets that would emerge once we start digging deeper into her life and her practice. And of course, she's getting renewed attention right now because of the global developments in the art world. In the New Statesman in 2018, she's named as one of the 4 best British artists that you've never heard of, simply because they are women artists. And this is, of course, riding on the back of the Me Too movement, the rise to global attention of what we have not been doing in terms of looking at practices by women in the cultural and artistic fields. So that's not to say that, you know, we've been laggards in developing explorations and exhibitions around Kim Lim's practice. So already in 2019, she was part of our minimalism, space, light and object exhibition at the National Gallery, Singapore. And more recently, she was the subject of a small solo survey at the Tate Britain called Kim Lim, Carving and Printing, which really looked at the early practices in quite a bit of detail. Her inclusion in the minimalism exhibition was, you know, apt as well, because, you know, for many years, she was also framed as a minimalist artist within the British establishment. So if you went into the Tate Modern's collection displays, you would see her work there in the section on minimalism. However, at the National Gallery Singapore, we are putting her works to slightly different use, and also changing the framing around which her works will be seen and received. So this is the work Day, which is a large sculptural, steel sculptural work that occupies kind of a central axis in the corridor of the Southeast Asia Gallery. And you will also find that she is there in this work Irrawaddy in the Singapore Gallery. So she is an artist that we want to kind of pitch as someone that traverses both Singapore and the Southeast Asia region. And because she's been getting a lot of renewed attention lately, we find that also our own programmers are getting interested in developing more programs around her work. So collaborations with students. Here you have students, dance and music students from the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, developing performances in response to the sculptures that we have in the National Collection. And so you can go on to YouTube and view these performances. More recently, we've also had Adele Tan, who is the avant-garde toy pianist, performer, and composer, responding to her works by playing some of John Cage's and George Crumb's music. But that's not to say, actually, that Kim Lim herself has not been valued and shown in her lifetime. So she had several solo exhibitions and numerous group exhibitions as well. In London, one of the more important surveys was the one in 1979 at the Round House in Chalk Farm in London. And so in this show, she had a full-scale display, also using the architecture of the Round House Gallery being circular to explore, you know, her notions of infinity in there. So for her, she doesn't believe in, you know, the kind of strict separations and categorizations. She finds flow passages much more interesting, and in terms of the permutations as well. And the last solo, which is a retrospective after her death, was given to her at the Camden Arts Centre in 1999. So one of the chief difficulties of mounting a research-based exhibition around Kim Lim is also to do with the fact that although she is a name being mentioned very often nowadays in the scholarly realms, but also in the commercial sectors, there's actually not so much discourse that has been really seriously been produced. And also the works have been dispersed quite a bit across the globe. And one of the early works that we had wanted to show, this is RR, or Rolls-Royce, which was a work that she showed at the 4th Nagaoka Contemporary Art Award exhibition. But due to the closure of this museum and its dispersal to the Kumagata Jukichi Memorial Art Museum, which has now, which does not allow outgoing loans, this work may unfortunately never see the light of day in exhibitions outside of Japan. And another work that we have been trying to figure out where it is Spiral 3. And these are works that are cited in public spaces, especially the one cited in Nature. And this was part of the collection of Alistair McAlpine, a famous British industrialist who went to Australia, but also gifted numerous works to the public collections in Australia as well. So you will find that Kim Lim is being somewhere out there in many different public collections. And then the mammoth task now is to reassemble and relocate where these works have been. So to begin kind of looking into the practice of Kim Lim, this is a quote that often comes up in many different ways that she's expressed this, but this is perhaps the most complete, which is that she will insist that her concern in sculpture is not so much involved with volume and mass and weight, but rather with form, space, rhythm, and light. So the last 4 elements are aspects that are really important to her, and in terms of her making and also the exhibiting of her sculptures and her prints. And so it's something that she thinks about all the time as she manipulates her material, punctuating the space, especially with intervals, and getting them floating or suspended, and also playing with corners, the floors, and shadows in terms of lighting. So it's interesting that she says that she is pushing the medium or process to the edge, so long as one does not fall off the edge. So it is also in terms of the exhibition making that we're trying to figure out where this edge is, because of the nature of her work and the nature of the reception of her work. It is quite easy to kind of codify the presentations of her practice. Now, Kim Lim also comes to us via a series of well-taken photographs. And she is also a photographer herself. She kept a darkroom and she develops her own prints. But I'm very struck by the series of photographs, portraits of her, in fact, looking through her artworks, posing with her artworks, as if she and the works are in a kind of a dialogue, but also in a moment of suspension. So here she is posing with her work, an early work abacus, and she gazes out through the openings of the metal wires, almost beckoning us, in a kind of suggestive way. But of course, one could argue that, this is also a kind of exoticist, orientalist framing, which is something that she had been deliberately wanting to move away from, especially as a Chinese female artist coming from Singapore to the UK to study at the Central St. Martin School of Art, and then later on at the Slade. So more typically, she'll be posing with her works in her own studio subsequently. And this is her array of maquettes and test prints that she will have on her desk. And subsequently, she would also get professional photographers to photograph her posing with her sculptures. And I find this gesture of a kind of a self-aware documentation of herself as an artist next to her artworks really kind of quite mesmerizing, because in a way that she is also articulating a kind of musculature, the energies and the kind of physical investments that she will have vis-a-vis making sculptures, but also a kind of assertion of her kind of saying to us, hey, look at me, I am an artist. So as a sculptor, she has declared herself more of a carver than a builder-upper. And she likes to kind of take away things from a material that she's been given. And this is something quite evident as we kind of look through the works that she's made, including also her prints. And she's done quite a number of etchings as well. And as she grew older, the kind of physicality of the creative process becomes more evident through the photographs. And here she's being depicted by Andrew Caitlin with the hammer and chisel, working on stone, which is a material that she subsequently became a kind of primary material that she worked with in her later years. But I'm really also drawn to, the later pictures of Kim Lim, because it also marks a kind of a transition for me in terms of the appreciation of her as a woman artist who has grown out of that early kind of young female frame, almost exoticized and orientalized frame. And then here as a kind of a modern figure, holding her own next to the material. And so similarly, like with this picture, River Stone, with her working on River Stone in '91, demonstrating, her own kind of strength and steel when working on this 3/4 ton slab of marble, just after having surgery on his spine. So there's something about Kim Lim that, has been talked about, which is that she defies, or she wants to defy, the kind of classification or the kinds of discourses, that we would like to wrap around her and her art. And this is also seen in her own appreciation of herself as an artist, and her fear of being trapped in a kind of sterility. But in exhibition making, this is also something that we would need to bear in mind when working with her work, which is largely abstract, because it doesn't immediately give you, a context in which you can discern and latch onto. So the next couple of slides will be kind of going through the works that are in the national collection. The works themselves have a range that will introduce to us the kind of key periods in which, you know, certain materials take center stage. And it really shows the kind of range that she had as a sculptor. So in the earlier phases of her practice, she mainly worked with plaster, wood, and metal, which is bronze and aluminum. And so in Abacus, you see, you know, signs already that she's working through her sculptural language by also not forgetting where she came from, which that of her Asian background and culture. But at the same time, she's not wholly beholden to, you know, her Asian heritage. And this is something that, you know, which is, you know, truly fascinating about tracking the kind of also names and titles that she gives to her sculptures. In 1962, soon after, she made this work called Pegasus, not just also in one material, she made this also in bronze. And in this wooden metal Pegasus, which is a reference to the ancient Greek mythology, Pegasus, the winged horse, the panels that are attached to the central spine of this sculpture is also movable. So there's something of a correlation in terms of the morphology of the sculpture with the story and narrative itself. And besides Pegasus, she's also made another sculpture called Centaur, which is another horse reference. And Centaur famously is that of this combination of the human upper half and the horse lower half. But as we get into a kind of late 60s, we see a kind of a shift that is more kind of germane with what was also happening in the wider artistic scene in the UK. So steel and enamel paint start, you know, creeping into the practice and the vocabulary. And as you see here, this is a very large and tall sculpture, which is also in the collection of the Hepworth Wakefield. And in steps as well. And in Echo from 1967. Well, this kind of trio of sculptures form a kind of a fascination point for me, because this, for me, is an area which perhaps has not received as much attention, which is that of her use of color in her sculptures. So it's only with the metal works that you find that she has been exploring the application of color and whether, you know, she has been successful in these applications is something that we wanted to kind of explore and find out. But of course, there are not so many examples of this, and this is a period which is quite striking, but short-lived, with not so many examples that we can kind of fully kind of explore with. But what I also wanted to say is that her references to kind of primary structures and shapes remain in the foreground. And with even a sculpture like Echo, you can see that she, the work bears with it also references to strong fascination with ancient Chinese sculpture, typically for her, the Shang bronzes, Shang period vessels. And with column, this is a specific technique that she also is quite drawn to, which is putting several segments together and alluding to an architectural feature in a built-up space. Interestingly, for column 1971 to 72 here, we have shown it mostly flat on the ground, but in fact, the work can be also shown stacked upright. Which also then leads me to this next work, intervals 1+2. The subsequent works that you will see play around quite a lot with her own ideas about permutations and change. So like column, which allows for different orientation, intervals 1+2 is a very playful sculptural mode which allows for the recipient to display the sculptures in many different permutations. So as one can see, this is intervals 1, which is the central spine of the display. But intervals 2 can be taken apart and put together in different ways. So already she's trying to figure out, in terms of the regularity of the intervals that she's put into here in terms of the ladder form. There's also play that is made possible through the recombinations of intervals 2. So in this work, you can already see the kind of tension, the balance that she's had to create between what is constant and then what is changeable. And in some ways, within the change, she's also being tremendously precise because for intervals 1, she has allowed for it to be either displayed on the ground, leaning against the wall, or fully flat on the wall itself. But at the same time, she also prescribes the necessary distance the work has to have from the ground to the top. And so her interests with space, space in between and lines and negative spaces continue. And here you see interstices 3, which are 3 regular hewn wooden strips. But at the same time, they can also conjure up landscapes, natural forms. So here, the little slivers of pine wood logs aligned and leaning onto each other, evocating the flow of water. And Irrawaddy is, of course, the major river that runs through Myanmar. So Southeast Asia is not far from her mind. In this work called Naga, she also references the Southeast Asian mythological creature with its serpentine form. But here already, you will see that she has moved into a new phase of material processing. So here in the 80s is where you find that she has moved into a kind of a, well, I wouldn't say obsession, but a kind of focus on working with stone, particularly Portland stone, and then marble, granite, and then later on slate. here, long wall piece, which is installed in the Singapore gallery, is a really interesting sculptural proposition because it is so slim. It's almost disappears into the wall as you install it. So you almost have to kind of look for it if it's kind of installed in front of a white wall. And many times, you know, in larger sculptures, even if they are being taken apart in segments, like this sculpture, you will see that they look as if they all belong in, you know, as part of a single stone block. So that they're, although they are apart, they maintain this kind of formal unity within, in and of themselves. And also, not to forget that she takes particular care also in choosing the base, the plinths that go along with the sculptures. So they are not just, you know, supports for the sculptures, they are integral to the piece itself. Here, Langkawi, which refers to this small archipelago of islands on the east coast, the northwest coast of Malaysia. And then finally, a couple of years before she passes, there is River Run. You will find that in the later part of her practice, etched lines deep into the stones become a constant feature. And she finds these lines mimicking natural forces really well because they conjure up the erosive forces of water and also that of wind. So she's not only just a sculptor. Kim Lim is also a renowned printmaker, and prints take you know, a central place in her practice as well. And her prints have been spoken of as a mode of exploration for her, but without being spoken about as a kind of developmental gesture, which means that the prints are not an early part of an exercise that leads right up into the creation of a piece of sculpture. But they kind of form a kind of chiasmus. Sometimes, you know, she uses the print process to quickly work through an idea, or she would have the print, you know, as a kind of a starting point, laying it off, and then using that to come back to it later on for another piece of sculpture. But what I wanted to draw attention to is this kind of hypnotic repetition of form in the depictions in her prints. So when I was going through the collection, one of the questions was in my mind, which is that why do we have so many kind of repeats, you know, the same motif of prints in the collection? But as I kind of looked more and more, you know, at the works themselves, it gradually also dawned on me that this is the kind of repetition, but with a different aspect that she has going on in her print practice as well. And it has been said that this kind of repetition of a motif or a mark also resembles what goes on in nature in terms of, you know, cyclical patterns. So you can see here we have 3 gates, all made in 1974. Either the colors changed or she's printed it on different substrates, with one on Japanese paper on the right. And then we have here Stack from 1975 being printed on different colored paper. And here with the prints, the woodcuts, A minor and C major. referencing, musical motifs, but also kind of appropriate because you can see how this, in fact, creates a kind of rhythm or even a melody through our eyes. So where I want to go with Kim Lim tonight is to also look at the other things that have thus far not been said so much about her. And this brings me to kind of looking at the kind of, points of disconnect or kind of undersaid moments of materials or her histories or narratives. So where I begin is also her own story, her own family story in Singapore, where her father and mother are in fact persons of note in Singapore's history. Her father is Lim Kun Teck, who was a British educated civil servant. He was one of our magistrates in the colonial service. And he was sent out to the Strait settlements, being a magistrate in Malacca and Penang. And most importantly, he was also part of our delegation to London on this Merdeka mission, which is Merdeka meaning independence, which was this point of this delegation going to London seeking Singapore's independence from the British. And her own mother as well was someone who comes from a haloed family in Singapore, being the kind of descendant of an early pioneer, Tan Tock Seng. There's a famous hospital named after him. And so this is a kind of family background that also starts to, fill the picture of how we begin to look at Kim Lim as an artist, how she managed to get to London, and the resources that she had at her disposal at the time. So already you can see this is her grandfather, Xiao Po Ling, who was a banker at the time. Kim Lim very modestly talks about her own family in an interview in the British Library Archives as middle class. But I would say that her family is more than middle class. In fact, I would say that she would be circulating in a kind of elite circles in Singapore. But because of the family relations that, have emerged, in my sightline as part of my research, other aspects of her practice come into view. And so I started to notice much more, references to Southeast Asia and more typically to Malaya in her work. So when she is titling her sculptures Trengganu and Borneo, and also here Kuda, which incidentally also means horse in Malay. Now the kind of descriptions of Kim Lim herself is also starting to change in my mind, where one would say that she's often kind of described as a Singaporean British sculptor. I would say that she is more Malayan British in this regard. And in fact, if you go look up the interview that she did with the British Library Archives, most of her recollections have to do with her being a child, with her parents up in Malacca and in Penang. And also, another point of fascination for me was her own experience as a child growing up during World War II and during Japanese occupation in Singapore and Malaysia. And this led me to think about different ways in which we can also read her sculptures. In particular, these works that reference Japanese aesthetics. So most times, the write-ups would talk about her appreciation of the beauty, the simplicity of Japanese art and architecture. But for me, when I'm reading it against her, also her recollection of her time under, Japanese wartime occupation, the kind of cultural facets of the Japanese come to the fore, especially to do with aspects of violence and cruelty, and then reading it also with her own explication of her penchant for carving and cutting. And so there's a remarkable passage in the archives where she's talking about her kind of rearing fighting fish, right? And this honor code that she gleaned from, Japanese culture, which meant that any kind of losing party would need to take the path of death, because the path of death is that of honor. And so she has this description, which is a little bit gory, which is that she would, if her fish, her fighting fish ever lost the match, she will be the one to chop off their heads. And so a kind of a placid appreciation of sculptures from the 60s that reference Japan now has a kind of different interpretive gloss to it. And the next bit that I want to go into is her creative partnership with her husband, the Scottish sculptor William Turnbull. I think this is an aspect that perhaps has not received as much attention from scholars, which is that this kind of creative dyad can be also read through the works that were produced during their lifetimes. Interestingly, Kim Lim has always maintained that they both run very individualistic practices, even though they have shared quarters, so they kind of share the space, but they have their own discrete areas. And this is a moment for me to think about ways in which, their own language development through sculpture could have influenced, their individual pathways. So already in 1984, there was a paired solo exhibition of Kim Lim and William Turnbull at the National Museum Art Gallery in Singapore as part of our International Artist series. But she was also, or rather he was also her traveling partner. And they went to many places together, developing also their own appreciation of these different cultures and their aesthetics, and bringing aspects of this back into their own creative works as well. So a little bit about William Turnbull. He was an RAF pilot during the Second World War, which meant that he was also stationed for a while in India and Sri Lanka. But when they got married in 1960, William Turnbull frequently, went on trips to the Far East with Kim Lim, and the aesthetics of these different countries have also seeped into their sculptural language as well. So with the Panch Mahal, you can see this kind of fascination with space and intervals and airiness that punctuates in Kim's own sculptural language. And then all the archaic forms that they've encountered in their travels in Greece, in Turkey, and then even in Cambodia are also present in, the sculptural language for both of them. So even like what I've mentioned in the mid-period of her practice, where she experimented with color, you can see this experiment also present in the works of William Turnbull. And then even in the later works in 1979, with this kind of axe-head torso, the striations that are present within the work, within his sculptures, the incisions, may also be interesting kind of points of departure for us when we are looking at the surfaces of Kim Lim's stoneworks. But perhaps the one that makes the most kind of impact would be this exhibition, where Kim Lim is the only female artist in this lineup of current British art at the Hayward Gallery in 1977. As you can see, the selectors were Michael Compton, Howard Hodgkin, and William Turnbull himself. And so this was quite a kind of a shocking development at the time, where also in the late 70s, there was greater feminist consciousness, greater agitation for parity of representation. The next Hayward Annual was going to have a kind of a 360 turnaround, where the selectors are all women, and Kim Lim being one of them. So taking inspiration from that, possibly, as the work Caryatid, where these were caryatids were sculptural figures, predominantly female, that supported the emblemetra on their heads. And so they were architectural features. But at the same time, one can also read into these caryatids as a kind of subsequent kind of reflection of her position as a female and as an artist. But what I want to kind of go back to is this kind of period that perhaps is not really kind of mentioned and spoken about. Because on the one hand, the appreciation is that she is there, she's made it, and she's being seen, and making to, this panel of female selectors. The reviews and the reception of Hayward Annual 78 was anything but kind and unanimous. So by all quarters, this was kind of a mixed exhibition. But more importantly, to feminist scholars and artists, they saw this exhibition as a kind of a missed opportunity. So even though we had a panel of, full female panel artists as selectors, the outcome of this exhibition was that the more provocative, the more challenging practices of feminist artists at the time were sidelined, and the exhibition itself, although it increased the representation ratio of female artists, didn't do very much to shake up the rules of engagement in the establishment. So what in the end ended up happening was that this was a kind of a showcase of quite safe and predictable and more or less formalist art. So as you can if you can see Mary Kelly, one of the feminist artists that, you know, suffered a lot of brickbats from this exhibition, received very little support. And her works, you know, that talk about the roles, rather the, you know, stereotypical roles and the structural subservience of women in the society, doesn't get much airplay in this exhibition at all. I'm coming to the end. So where does this leave us with Kim Lim and Singapore? So many times people have been talking about Singapore reclaiming artists as their own, including Kim Lim, who has this kind of bicultural identity. She is someone, I think, is who is a kind of necessary kind of correction to what we have as, you know, part of our sculptural legacies and sculptural landscapes. So when Kim Lim was asked if she, you know, saw any, you know, other types of public sculpture, the only one that she could remember seeing and mentioned was the statue of Stamford Raffles. And so in our mindscape in Singapore, you know, our sculptural landscape is, you know, occupied by these colonialist sculptures. Which leads me into this kind of interesting quote from a Dutch economist who also helped the, you know, economic development of Singapore, Albert Winsemius, that he very much advocated for, you know, these statues and these sculptures of our, you know, former colonizers to be present, because it is a way for us to show that we need them and that we welcome them. And so to end, I would say that perhaps this time is an appropriate and a good time to open up this aperture for us to now change this landscape and start to think about what other forms of sculpture should now occupy our vision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adele. That was, I think, a very interesting study informed for all of us, and a great introduction to Kim Lim's work. Just a couple of questions, I think, because we're close to you know, time. But one of the questions we have, Prati asks, can Kim Lim's whole body of works be considered a part of or as influenced by the minimalist movement? Or do we rather see her works as the unexplored diasporic art, forgotten due to not belonging to one particular culture, since she's a, you know, British Singaporean artist?
I think it's really more of the latter. How she kind of entered the minimalist frame, I think, was also at the time curators and historians were trying to find a way to place a practice. It became a kind of an easy shorthand when you just start to just look at the most visible superficial forms that you have at hand. So, you know, the kind of sleek lines, you know, relatively regular planes. So all of those things led to a kind of subsumption of this period of work, pretty much in the 70s. So this was a time where also the language itself was also aligned with, you know, kind of global vocabularies, right? But if you kind of also look more closely into the treatment of material, you can see that it is actually, it deviates from the minimalist language also completely. With, you know, minimalists, they, you know, didn't really care so much about the hand of the artist. It was more industrial processing to, you know, create this kind of distance between the, you know, the artwork or the product and then that of artistic genius. But Kim Lim is someone who cares very much about the surface of her works. So, you know, she would, you know, kind of seal the wood, but then also sand it down, right? So that it doesn't have this kind of a gleam to it, and it comes across more natural. So I think her affinity with, you know, materials and getting kind of close up with it would distinguish her from a kind of straightforward minimalism frame.
Okay, so I think something you said ties into the next question, where you were talking about the idea of the artist, and clearly from some of the writing that you shared, you know, quotes from her, she was quite aware in terms of her positions and quite articulate about what she was trying to achieve with her practice. So I was just wondering, you know, is this also how she's read by curators in general? Is this also how she's read by the audience in general?
Yeah, so her words tend to be taken to heart by, you know, a lot of scholars and curators. And by and large, I think we have tried to stick quite closely to her own kind of self-representation. So I guess the challenge for me, where that quote about not falling into sterility comes in as a kind of reminder, which is also why I've been trying to look at other places where there are these bits of disconnect, right? So looking at how she connects much more closely with the region in Southeast Asia, to consider her as Malayan. That part of her life is there and present. And so when I was preparing, you know, for this talk, and the previous talk was, of course, on transnational in curatorial practices, right? There's something about her work that pretty much enfolds her into the kind of transhistorical, or but at the same time, you know, we lose a kind of specificity because she likes to look at her works in terms of sympathies and continuities instead of breaks and dissonances. I find this quite an interesting moment where I am trying to introduce some tension and looking at ways in which other bits can be explored, or rather to put more specific contextual information back into the reading of her life and her work. Yeah, which I think has not yet been explored, which is why I was keen on digging up more about her family history in Singapore, and then her own creative partnership with her husband, and then thirdly, herself as a kind of a female artist in the UK, because there is this kind of, I think it will happen, a kind of feminist reappreciation of her work. Yeah, because she has, interestingly, abjured from being kind of framed as a female feminist artist because she doesn't want to be seen as an other. She doesn't want to be othered, being a female and foreign. So these are taxonomic categories that she's been kind of fighting, I guess, ever since she came to England, right? Yeah, but for me, I'm interested in them as structural categories. How do they inform our reading of her as an artist practicing in the UK at the time?
Wonderful. We have one more question that I think we can take very quickly. Kritika asked, do you see any parallels between the works of Kim Lim and Alexander Calder? I guess if you have the moving wings of Pegasus, and could you think of her work as connected art?
Looking at, a lot of the sculptural works, there is movement, but it's suggested. So there's not actual movement in the works themselves. So she allows permutations and play with the configurations, but once it's there, it's still. So there's and people do talk about this as a kind of a stillness, a zenness even. Well, I don't like to use the word zenness. To her sculptures and even her prints, right? But on occasion, she has made explorations into parts that can move. So, so there is a work in the I think Arts Council collection in the UK called Candy. It's a brightly colored sculpture, and apparently it's been treated so that it can swivel, so it twists around. And there's also a print work, a two-sided kind of hanging mobile. So it's kind of a sandwich disc that then is suspended and then it rotates. Yeah. But by and large, I've not actually seen Alexander Calder's name yoked and kind of mentioned together with Kim Lim. Yeah.
All right. Last question. I think it's a two-part question. One, whether you think, I mean, in some of this, some of the things that we've looked at in terms of the sort of titles that she's given her works, or even in the sort of the work you were just talking about, Candy, would you say that, that there's a sense of play in her practice? And also, do you have a favorite work?
Okay, first question, sense of play. There's definitely a sense of play or playfulness. So this is something that I want to also tease out in the show, by using also that, eccentric exploration of coloration with her sculptures. Although small and short-lived, it is there. So I'm looking at these moments of eruption of difference in her practice. And so one can also look at the numerous maquettes that she's made, in preparation for the larger sculptures. And so these are like, hand size, and you can like pick them up. And she, in her early kind of sculptural works in the 60s, she's also made these pseudo pieces that look like chess pieces. In fact, they're actually named chess piece, some of them. And there's a knight, there's a king, and there's a queen. So stratagems, games, play, it's definitely there. Yeah. But I guess as she moved towards the kind of second half, when she's working with stone, then it's more in terms of the fidelity to the material itself, because the stone has its own qualities, right? And it will let you know what it is that it can do. Because if there's a fault, a particular striation in the block of stone, you kind of also have to follow it. You can't be willful. So there's a kind of a tension between the material and then you as an artist, as a person who's striving to master this block of stone, but you don't often succeed. Yeah. So, and she's talked about this as in terms of a dialogue. Yeah. Was the second question about my favorite work?
Just to close it out, do you have one? Or can you actually make it one work? Can you pick one? I wouldn't say favorite, but the work that kind of struck me in my early, kind of looking into Kim Lim was Intervals 1 and 2, which is that ladder looking work that we have. Primarily because, when I was reading up the notes that she's kind of given
as a kind of installation instructions for the work, I was quite surprised at the meticulousness of it all. And this is kind of also interesting later on, finding out that because she was a wartime child and her education was disrupted, she was good in English and arts, but not good at math. So the geometry and the kind of quite specific calculations that she's had with this particular work kind of doesn't quite gel with her kind of her phobia of mathematics at that time. But I guess one could kind of rely on the constancy of geometry there. Yeah. And perhaps for me, it was quite a revelation to see the permutations in these images, but I've never actually seen exhibitions trying them out in terms of the different permutations. So that's something that I'm looking forward to try to do in the show, which is to perhaps have the work rotate in terms of its presentation. Yeah. So maybe you will, have 4 ways to, display this work.
That sounds very exciting, and I hope we all get a chance to see the show sometime. Things not preventing. But thank you so much, Adele, for coming on to deep dive onto the MAP platform and for this wonderful talk. Thank you, Diksha, for interpreting for us today. And do stay on for 10 minutes, everyone, to watch our episode of Museums Without Borders in collaboration with the Vicha Design Museum. And thank you for tuning in today.
Thank you.
We're here today to talk about a subject very close to my heart, which is seating design in India. And we're going to be doing a dialogue between MAP and Vicha, which, as we all know, is an iconic place for seating design. Here we're going to be talking about an iconic form of seating, which is the low seat or the pida chair. So welcome and come on in. So we're talking about the interpretation of this chair, why this design, why the low seat, why do we have low seating that existed in our country at that time. So really low seating came about as a manner of just giving a person of higher authority reinforcement. So if you were sitting with a group of people, which mostly everybody sat on the floor or a carpet or a qaleen, then you gave a person of nobility or a doctor or a learned man or a priest just an elevated seat, just slightly off the ground, to reinforce his authority. That's really the reason for this structure and this form. And the arcaded back is an exquisite feature here, and you'll see it across chairs at that time, which were, if you think about the throne, that is something that we've all seen. If you look at manuscripts, if you look at miniatures, they all have arcaded backs. I mean, the elevated seat exists just as an elevated seat or a stool. All our sculptures, think about the gods and goddesses across Ajanta, Buddhist carvings, all of it. You'll see elevated seats, the lotus seat, different forms of seating, and the arcaded back in some. So obviously in our chair, the pida chair, we see a gentle recline, that is for comfort, because an absolute straight, which is a beautiful commonality with the red blue chair. It's almost an identical form of recline, angle of recline. And yes, so that I guess is for comfort and also for perhaps for authority again.
The red-blue chair by Dutch designer and architect Gerrit Rietveld is not your typical armchair. However, it has some of the typical features of an armchair. It has a low seating position, armrests, a high backrest. Still, it is an armchair main structure. It does not have upholstery, no textiles, no skin, no comfort really offered by any type of upholstery. It is a chair that is stripped to its main structure, consisting basically of two elements, slats and boards. 13 slats altogether, 6 of them for the vertical posts, 7 of them for the horizontal rails, and then 2 wider slats for the armrests. And in addition to that, 2 boards, one for the backrest and one for the seat.
So we talk about the production of this chair. So obviously it's a one-off, it is a handcrafted piece, and there are many similar kinds of chairs that exist in this form, and those similarities and differences would occur based on region and on purpose. So if you were creating a Pida chair in Rajasthan, it would be made from wood that was locally sourced from there. And if you were creating a chair in Gujarat, then it would use material that was locally and easily available there. And again, it would be influenced by cultural habits. So if you ate in a particular way or addressed an audience in a particular way, it would be designed as per that. So Joshen, the red-blue chair by Rietveld, why do you think he chose this color palette? What is the significance of these very strong colors?
Looking back at the design of the red-blue chair in the 1950s, Rietveld stated that he had also been looking at the color theory of Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who was himself inspired by the color theory of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe as an inspiration. Rietveld said that he wanted to create a chair out of the most essential elements in terms of geometric shapes, but also in terms of the essential colors. What do you know about the maker of your chair? Was it made by one person, or were there a number of craftsmen involved?
It is more likely that a team of people got together, and this is the result of a combined effort. You could see the jali work, the piercing, the woodwork, the jute work. It's a combined effort, as it has always been, and it's really a wonderful way of working and something for us to learn from, I think, even today. So Rietveld is the founding member of the Desir movement. Now, what were the principles of it, and what principles do we see reflected in the chair?
Rietveld's red-blue chair is closely associated with the style, the group founded in 1917 by Theo van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian, a group of painters, architects, and even a poet who were asking for a new art at the end of World War I, asking for a new art that represented a new world order opposite to the one that had created this terrible war and the destruction in its wake. One of the reasons the chair has been associated with the style is the closeness of Rietveld to Theo van Doesburg and the De Stijl group, but most obviously the color scheme, because it corresponds with the color schemes used by the painters of the De Stijl movement.
The chair did exist in many other versions. You have basically a 4-legged device is called a charpai, and a 3-legged device is called a tipai. And like that, you've got the chauki, and you've got what we have here, which is a pida, also patla. So depending on the region, you have different names and different purposes. So according to the purpose, the object was altered and adapted to suit its primary purpose. So across Gujarat, Rajasthan, you will find different kinds of woodwork, different kinds of material. They vary just slightly based on what's locally available, what was locally available at that time. And of course, the way they lived or the way they ate, and whatever the primary purpose of that chair, as I said, was. Many prominent architects have designed chairs, and one has even famously said that it is more difficult to design a chair than it is to design a building. Now, what are the similarities between the two forms of architecture or design? What are the similarities between them, particularly in the case of the red-blue chair?
The chair is a very architectural chair because it's all about the load-bearing structure, which is not hidden. And because of those particular connections that Rietveld created, it almost has the appearance of an axonometric. The slats look like vectors in space that could protrude endlessly. The red-blue chair is a wonderful example of how, in the history of modernism, art, architecture, and design have always cross-pollinated each other. What can you say about the ornamentation of the chair? Say the two bird-like ornamentations are at the backrest Was there any influence of Mughal art and architecture on the design of the chair?
So the ornamental carvings of the back of this chair, which make it quite the striking feature of it, we can see at the arcaded back there is a 6-point star, which is called the Shatcone. Now the Shatcone comprises of 2 triangles, an upward triangle and a downward triangle. Now this is a yantra that represents male and female principles and is a symbol of cosmic energy, because of course it combines the two. We also see several forms of carving in this chair. You can see relief, etching, turning, all of this. And again, this is a very unique part of Indian furniture, or furniture in India at that time, where it was combining several kinds of techniques and skill sets. On the second row, we can see 10 spindles. Now, this is again interesting to note because it is widely understood that the Indian form of design at that time was really about decoration. But I want to point out that these 10 spindles that have been arranged in the second row are actually performing a function. They're holding and reinforcing and putting the chair together. So they're really function that's doubling up as decoration. And I think that's really clever, another sort of commonality with Western design, where decoration is integrated into the function and therefore it exists, otherwise it wouldn't. In the third row, we see, of course, the jalis and the swastik shape, which has a floral and geometric pattern around it, a really beautiful combination of the two. All the frames that these details have been set into are elaborately sort of carved with floral vines. At the back, interestingly, it's been left plain. So that's interesting. It probably was used by somebody who had an audience, and therefore the front was probably seen more prominently than the back. And I think that reinforces what the use of this chair may have been. It must have been to attend to an audience, which is why they've left the back plain. Otherwise, it's unusual. Normally, even Indian jewelry, the back is always detailed.
The chair for our collection was originally purchased at an auction. And in around 2013, it was appraised by Dutch experts on restoration and Dutch furniture design. And they dated the chair on 1927, meaning that it was probably manufactured in the studio of Gerard van der Khan.
You know, an interesting aspect of design in India, or sourcing design in India, is that it just is in various homes of the country. It's just hidden in the various homes. And we're really lucky that the Podar family had this chair from as far as they can remember. And I think it dates back probably to the 1900s or early 1900s. And that's how it sort of came into the map collection naturally.